So I've been discussing a bunch of different decks, strategies, and products. So I thought it'd be good to put it all in one video, some of the common TCG terms when talking about certain cards, strategies, play styles, and such. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with those terms and just want a more clear definition to be better understand when people use them, you're in the right place. So let me first start with aggro. I think that's the easiest one to explain. Aggro, just short for aggression. You just play aggressively as possible. You try to win the game as quickly as possible. You don't want the game to go long. And yeah, it's usually the most straightforward strategy, as you just make the most aggressive play possible, because that's what's going to get you to win the fastest possible. So some examples in Elestrals right now is cards like Necruff is a good aggro card, because not only does it have phenomenal attack, which is going to be a key thing for a lot of great aggro cards, is high attack, well, at least Elestrals, but also it's got a great effect that burns your opponent for one spirit when you attack over something. So it's chipping away at their resources, their life total, without having to actually connect an attack to the spirit deck. So it'll just kind of close out the game a bit quicker. So that's a really great example. And typically what you'll see with aggro decks is you'll see a lot of high attack Elestrals, cards that help you kind of clear the way so they can attack the spirit deck, such as removal. Earthquake is a phenomenal example of that. And yeah, other good cards are just other cards that just help you close out the game quicker, such as Eruption, which burns your opponent for 3 spirits. So that's typically what you're going to see. I use Fire as an example. It's a phenomenal aggro deck, but of course there are other combinations in here, and you'll see different kinds. So it doesn't need all that stuff, but I think the big thing that you're going to see with an aggro deck is that it needs to be able to have high attack to attack over stuff, and also probably some assistance in removal of Elestrals as well, as if your opponent throws a big stall, then you need something else to get over it as well. So that's what we see with common with aggro. That's kind of what it is. So kind of off of aggro, I wanted to talk about burn, because I mentioned cards like Necruff and Volcanic Forge, which remove spirit, force your opponent to expend spirits from the spirit deck directly. That's typically called burn. You're directly impacting the life total with card effects. And while you can build a burn strategy deck for sure, you do need a lot of cards to be able to do that. So, and typically it will meld in with other strategies. Do you want to play a slower burn deck? Then you'll probably pair that with the stall strategy. Do you want to pair it with aggro, perfect example, then to close out the game quicker? You can. So burn, it can be a strategy, but as you'll kind of see as I discuss these, some of them kind of just get melded with stuff. And really just overall, while I'm discussing these terms, it's not that you're so much like you have to fit into one of these perfect boxes I explain. It's just, generally speaking, these are the kind of different strategies and mindsets, and you can be a bit fluid with them, but also they're kind of great kind of structural stuff to plan your deck and how you want to play the deck around it as well. And so we kind of see aggro, which is pretty straightforward, is a more broad strategy. Meanwhile, you've got burn, which is more specific about what the deck is trying to do, and is more of a kind of splashable strategy in an overarching strategy as well. So you'll see a bit of that as well. I think the next good strategy to talk about is control. And control just typically means that you have cards that control one or a certain number of aspects of the game very well, and by having that control over those aspects, you can leverage it in a way to gain victory. So that's a very, very broad definition of control. Most commonly, you'll see it, I'll just, since we're talking about Elestrals here, use Elestrals as an example. Most commonly, you'll see control as destroy an Elestral, destroy a rune. You are controlling cards on the field by getting rid of it. But even that's a very specific example. Control can just include cards as well, like Rice Roast, which it doesn't destroy the card, but it really limits what cards can do on board. So as another control type card, it is more considered, you can use some term like soft control versus hard control, or hard control, you're just getting rid of the card permanently, while soft control, you're just limiting what they can do. Another good example of that would be Halo's Chariot Ride. Prevents your opponent from playing countermoves. That's a control card, it's limited what your opponent can do. And so that's kind of one aspect. Again, it's a very broad term, so those are more just focused on your opponent. You could even argue that burn cards are control because they're controlling the resource system as well. So you can throw burn in a control deck as well. That's definitely a valid option. Just look at Toxion. But then another facet of control is sometimes you're not necessarily controlling your opponent's stuff. You're controlling one of your aspects or one of your resources very, very well. And that's still technically a control deck as well. Such as, there really isn't too great of an example right now, but I'm trying to think of a good one. For example, aStrabbit is a decent example. You're looking at top view to control what you add to hand as well. It's not the best example, and I don't think, at least for a while now, we'll see much kind of control over an aspect of what you have very well. But theoretically, there can exist a deck in there, especially if you get some like great like self-spirit control, like recycling spirits to reuse more effectively. You can definitely have like a self-spirit control deck theoretically, but I think right now the more applicable control is mostly just controlling your opponent's board, your opponent's spirit deck, hand destruction. That's another great control example with like Spark Kit as well. So that is kind of what we see in control, very focused around Thunder, and that's not a coincidence whatsoever, but it can be more broad, like Sorlet's another great control card to look outside of Thunder and Wind, where you're just kind of controlling your opponent's board by letting Sorlet attack over it by flipping them their position so it can more easily attack over stuff. And yeah, that's honestly really good. And I think here's a great example where we can start talking about how cards can fit in multiple strategies and be used for multiple purposes. Nekruff could even be used in a control strategy. I don't think there's any deck that really supports it, but it theoretically could, as it's got a phenomenal attack stat to attack over your opponent's stuff, controlling the board, and it also controls the opponent's spirit deck. Sure, coincidentally, also works as an aggro card to push the game closer, but you don't necessarily have to use Nekruff in a way that tries to win the game faster. You can use it as a control tool for the deck. So I think that's a very important thing, is recognizing that cards can fit in multiple strategies based on what they do, because how you frame it, how you utilize it in your overall, how you play your deck, it can change just how you classify it, what it's doing. What the card says on paper or in its text versus what it can do in a strategy, a lot of times are two, I don't want to say very different things, but you see different results than what you can just analyze it just reading the card text by itself. So a lot there, but yeah, generally speaking, control, you're just controlling a certain aspect of the game, and I gave a few examples of it as well. So I almost forgot to mention with control that usually just playing control by itself won't result in a victory. You kind of need to ask yourself, why are you controlling the board? What is your end goal here? Because if you have control over something, you want to leverage it into a proactive strategy that actually wins you the game. For example, I played Voltempest control that it leverages the control I have over the opponent's Elestrals with cards like Riceros to more easily get into Voltempest to start burning down my opponent, which still is a control tool in itself because it limits what my opponent does, but also puts my opponent on a clock using a burn strategy as well, and also just a big beater to just hit him for 3 spirits as well. So that's a good example, but that's a very limited viewpoint. Technically, you can have your main strategy be burn, you can have it be mill, which I'll get into in a second, or you can just be stalling to then just throw out a big bomb to end the game and such, or stalls so your opponent does something that expends their own spirits and such. The payoffs are very few and far between because of the limited card pool right now, but just know that you need a payoff. And a lot of, as I kind of said, burn's a possible payoff as well. You'll see a lot of these kind of like more specific strategies that pair well with more of a backbone strategy. Controls that backbone strategy, and those more specific strategies can be your win condition. Since I mentioned mill, a mill strategy just means you're trying to run a ton of cards that send cards from the top of your opponent deck to their underworld, with the ultimate goal of running them out of cards in their deck to play, ideally either decking them out or just leaving them with no cards to play, and they can respond to your board. But most likely you're just winning because you deck them out and they get to their turn, they can't draw, they just lose by game rule. And this is a more specific strategy, obviously. You compare it with control, so you're trying to control what your opponent does, slow them down, progressing their game state, while you just kind of chip away at their deck, forcing them to get rid of cards, possibly losing out on great answers that they can use. You can also use mill in, like, I think the other obvious comparison is probably like a stall deck, because, well, I'll get to stall in a second, but as the name implies, you're stalling for something, and that something can be mill. So there isn't really too much to say about mill. It's kind of like burn in the sense that it's really splashable with other strategies. It's just your win condition pretty much. So I mentioned stall, so let me go over it. Stall is pretty much you're trying to slow down your opponent from progressing the board state. You're not actively trying to, you're just trying to stop your opponent from doing so. And it's a bit different than control in the sense that you're not trying to necessarily control what your opponent does. You're just trying to really build up your board to be as obnoxious to deal with as possible, not really trying to limit what your opponent does. Though a lot of times, control and stall can go hand in hand sometimes as well. So I can't say that they're completely separate, but really at its core, while control's really broad, trying to control aspect of the game, stall's more just trying to slow down your opponent from what they're doing. A lot of times in Elestrals, you'll see it be high defense stuff that are really obnoxious to attack over. Tsunami's a perfect example. Change everything to defense so your opponent just can't attack with anything. Those are great stall tools. They're not really progressing your board state, which a lot of times control does progress the board state. You're more so just slowing down what your opponent can do, and really you're stalling for some sort of win condition. And as I outlined, that could be like burn, mill. It can be a big combo as well, which I'll get into. So that's the general idea behind stall. I fully expect to see more kind of more dynamic stall tools coming out in the future. We already have like Altar of Stars as well, which is really neat. But that is kind of what we've seen in Elestrals so far, and it's really limited more so to water than any other type, just in general, because water just has such high defense right now. I guess another thing with stall, you might also see like protection effects on your Elestral, so it's not easy for them to get over, just to help you better stall it. So that's another aspect of control decks, is just protection from certain card effects on your Elestrals. Moving on to combo, since I did mention it when talking about stall, combo, like burn and mill, is really your win condition. And as the name implies, you're just trying to combo some cards together. So typically you'll have an idea of the exact cards you want to play in tandem, and that card combination should win you the game. And there's really no limit to what specifically they're doing. The important thing is whatever they do wins you the game. So for example, it can be you're just waiting to set up a, say, Timber with Artifact to then attack over your opponent's Celestial, go into Centaur with 5 spirits and attack them for 5. That could be your big combo just to kind of blow out the rest of your opponent's spirits. That's a good example of a combo. It could be, for what's another good example here? It could be something, see, I'm thinking about all the other card games I've played which have more clear combo decks. Wirtz had a good example of a more combo strategy where he wanted to set up a Leonite with Poseidon, Trident, Hephaestus, and Hammer, so it's near impossible to actually answer that Leonite. So that's another example of a combo. So that one's more of a slower combo that's trying to lock down the game, as opposed to a very explosive combo that's trying to win the game right then and there. There's a ton of breadth with combo, but that's just a little taste of it right now. So really, if you're just looking at cards and being like, okay, I want to combo these cards together because it has a really favorable outcome that will help me win the game, most likely you're playing a combo deck. You really want to pair combo with a stall or control deck, as those two deck backbones usually help you. It gives you time to draw into your combo pieces, because combos usually don't happen very quickly. You need time to accumulate your pieces, set it up, and so you need a strategy that supports giving you that time. And those two strategies are probably the best one to do it. But that being said, though, that's not to say that you can't have some combos in aggression, because really, when I say combo, it's not saying that like any 2-card combination is a big combo deck. You can have simpler, like smaller combos in the deck. But really, if you're saying I'm a combo deck, usually it's because you're waiting during the game to set up these specific cards and such. So I think that's an important distinction, that yes, you can have combos in aggro decks and whatever other deck, tempo, mid-range, which I'll get into. But when you think about like the purest form of a combo deck, you're usually pairing it with a slower strategy, because generally it'll take you time to pair up the big play you have in mind as well. I think another good strategy to kind of talk about that is important for a combo, as well as the final 2 more backbone strategies that I'm going to discuss, is value. Value is a very generic term in any sort of card game. It usually just refers to just getting value off your cards. Usually we talk about card economy, the exchange. You're using 1 card to get rid of 1 card. You're using 1 card to get rid of 2 cards. You're using 1 card to draw 2. That is all inherent to value, because one resource in every single card game is just the number of cards you have access to play. So obviously you want to get value out of your cards, and one of the easiest ways to measure it is how they interact with either getting rid of your opponent's cards, giving them 1 less card to use, or get you new cards to get more effects to use as well. So of course, value can also be a very general term just for what you get out of a card. But when I'm specifically talking about a value strategy, most of the time I'm talking about getting more access to more cards to use, or getting rid of your opponent's cards efficiently as well. The cards that get rid of your opponent's cards more efficiently, I should say. So that's the idea behind value. Really, value is usually splashed into certain decks. From what I've seen, especially from other card games, it's really hard for just pure value decks to exist because and I see this a lot in Elestrals right now. You can draw a million cards, but it just doesn't matter if you're not proactively playing something. So thus, usually you will see some strategies need a bit of value with them. You'll see cards like Nectar of the Gods being run is a perfect example, or cheap destruction answers that just kind of have great value because you're using up one card to either get you more cards or to get rid of your opponent's cards. It is pretty simple here. I don't think we'll ever see just a deck that just draws a million cards and just has a ton of card advantages, like you just have more cards in hand than your opponent. But more on the small scale, like perfect example, if you saw my match against Jay Johnny in the finals, where I used Triple Ambrosia with a Drataya. Drataya is a really good value card. It draws you more cards. You use one Ambrosia, you get two back. And that's the kind of thing that I see more just splashable value engines to give you access to cards to help propel your main strategy forward. So aggro decks like Nectar of the Gods, because it gives them more cards to throw down in their aggressive strategy to close out the game sooner. Control like Straw Power, because it can draw into more of its control tools to better answer whatever your opponent's board state is. And the list goes on. I could list it for all the strategies, but I hope I've made my point clear about value. So final two strategies I really want to discuss. The first one being tempo. Discussed really in depth about tempo in my Centaur starter deck guide video, but I'll revisit it here. Tempo typically is viewed as you're trying to set the pace of the game at the beginning of the game and then control the game from there on out to maintain that tempo, because if you set up the tempo in your favor and you control it from there on out, you should just win in the long run. So it's sort of like comboing aggro and control into one here. So it's more of a like even paced deck. You're not trying to go blitz your opponent down. It's just a smooth pace once you've kind of set it. And I think this strategy is actually really rewarded by the rules of Elestrals, honestly. So part of that, so if any of you don't know what I mean by tempo, it's just kind of the pace at which the game it develops, progresses is the better word. And really we can see this a lot in Elestrals as it favors tempo, with just being able to use your normal cast each turn to deal with your opponent's Celestial, just attack over it the most efficient way. You want to be usually equal or ahead on spirits when you end your turn. And if you can keep doing that even exchange, or even get better, maybe get multiple Elestrals out on board and get ahead on tempo, then if you can maintain that pace, you're going to just win. Simple as that. So it's probably one of the easiest strategies to learn. It's trying to know a good word to describe it. It's personally the strategy I'm most comfortable with as well. So I think a lot of how I think about it is less in words and more just kind of understanding. But I do think in general it's a very easy strategy to kind of pick up on. I think it's pretty obvious once you play that, you want to be ahead on spirits. You want to make sure that when you normal cast an Celestial, you can deal with your opponent's Celestial. Not even just normal cast. You want to deal with your opponent's Celestial each turn. That way, your opponent isn't able to get to your spirit deck or ascend and such. So really, it's my personal favorite strategy, because you still feel like you're being more proactive than a control deck, but you also still have that nice control over what your opponent's doing that a control deck has. So it's a really fun strategy in my opinion, and it's a lot of times if you're just learning the game with no previous preconception, most likely how you're playing the game is tempo, just based on the fact it's pretty obvious that you just want to attack over it. I guess a good way to put it is it literally rewards you from playing the game how the rules intended it, and that's normal cast, attack over your opponent's Celestial. Just plain and simple. It's the most basic thing you can do in the game. So the final strategy I wanted to discuss was mid-range. And while control is focused around being aggressive in the early game, setting the pace of the game, how it progresses, and then controlling the game state and the rate the game progresses, the tempo throughout the latter half of the game to win the game, mid-range is the exact opposite of that. You want to control the game in the early stages, not let your opponent get ahead until you get to the mid game, where you just kind of start throwing threat down after threat down after threat down, just making it really hard for your opponent to keep answering whatever you're playing out, and just kind of pushing your opponent out of the game that way. And in Elestrals, I haven't really seen this too terribly much. And I just think it's because the cards we have that would need to wait till the mid game to come down have such easy answers right now. So the cards that see the best value are the one spirits because they're the least punished by stuff like counter runes, destruction effects, and such. And there's just no wide board removal, so only single target Elestral removal. So going wide is also really good. So I don't think we'll really see mid range until two spirit Elestrals are more of a viable strategy, as I think that's where mid range will really lie, is being able to control the game so you can go into a two spirit Elestral and just kind of keep setting up those threats turn after turn. That's why I envision mid range looking like. And the reason, I don't think I fully explained it. The reason that it really doesn't exist right now is because the one spirits that you would play in a mid range strategy can just be played in an aggro strategy or a tempo strategy right now. So it just doesn't make sense to play mid range right now when you can just play aggro or tempo, honestly. But I hope we see some more good mid range cards moving forward. I could also see mid range cards, a mid range deck focusing around card effects that don't trigger until you or your opponent are below a certain spirit threshold. That could also be another interesting way to develop a mid range deck. And really, like tempo and mid range, you can pair it with other strategies, but at the same time, they really just kind of want to focus on the core aspects of the backbone strategies I explained in aggro and control for the most part. With mid-range, I mentioned that you go from control to aggro, but I also wanted to make like a little side note here that there's another strategy some people will reference that I just thought of now, beatdown. So sometimes like more late game focused, bigger creature focused aggression will be known as beatdown because it's not the fastest. You have to wait to the late game for it. So you could say it's aggro for that pace of the game, like you're going a more aggro pace in the later game if you're just talking about how you progress the board state each turn. But at the same time, I do know that it might be a good distinction to make, and I know some people do make the distinction that aggro is talking more early game and beatdown's more late game, or at least that's how I've interpreted it moving forward. So I think the better way to clarify it is just that mid-range in particular is control in the early game to beat down the late game just with big beat sticks. And you can have a beatdown strategy without a mid-range strategy technically. You can technically play a control deck that wants to go later into the game, so in the late game, and then throw down big, giant, like big Elestrals that can just beat down your opponent. And usually that'll just be using the raw spirits on them to just attack the spirit deck or attack over Elestrals. So with all those strategies out of the way, I do want to say that your more aggro and tempo styles of play are going to be more favored in Elestrals right now. I kind of discussed this in my video yesterday, kind of going over Oistress, that it really feels like the cards are, in my opinion, are balanced around each other very well, but not necessarily the rules of the game. The rules of the game heavily favor more proactive strategies like tempo and aggro. Thus, those will feel so much better when actually playing the game, even if on paper they don't necessarily seem stronger than control or stall strategies, which aren't as proactive, thus they're hindered by the game. So those cards really need to be stronger. So a lot of the strategies I mentioned, those should theoretically become better as we get stronger and stronger cards to compensate for their inherent weakness with the game rules. But with that being said, though, if there's anything in this video that still confused you, want some clarification, please leave a comment down below. I'll be happy to answer it, and hopefully some other people watching videos that might also be knowledgeable in these terms can answer it. This is by no means me saying these are what these terms mean, like exact definitions. Again, there's a lot of fluidity in this. They're just kind of structures to help us better deck build, give us a basis to work off of and better develop as well. So if you can understand them and then start understanding the kind of fluidity with it, there's another better word for that. I'm doing really well in words. Let me think about that for a second. All I could come up with was like the words flexibility or malleability. I think what I'm trying to say is that these categories I set up are not black and white. They exist on a spectrum, but it's good to understand them at their core and kind of treat them a bit more black and white at first to understand them. And then as you improve your skills as a player, you can start understanding the nuance that exists within these strategies. But as I said, please comment down below if you have any questions, because I feel like there's plenty I could do to also refine this video. I want to put this out here now just because I think it's very important to get out here to help players. But at the same time, I do recognize that I probably could explain some of these better. So any feedback would be greatly appreciated. So maybe when we get closer to the official launch, I can revisit this video and film a more coherent and better version because frankly, I'm just going off of my own experiences with these strategies, and some of them I'm not as experienced with, so I don't think I explained them as well. So if I could get more information from the community about this sort of thing, that would be great, as I can help spread that information through these videos to help just players in mass get better at the game. But if you enjoy my content, please like and consider subscribing and turning on that notification bell. At the time of filming this, I am 10 away from 100 subscribers, which is just crazy to think about. When I started, I was, I think, around 40 just from prior stuff. So it's been really exciting to see that growth, seeing you all enjoy it. So thank you so much for all of that. And I'm going to mention this again in this video, but I have set up a drive here with all the images from the website. Still need to update it with the new some of the new reveals from today, but I ideally should be keeping these up to date so you can pull these for content creation, the images for custom deck uploads to Tabletop Simulator while we wait on the physical cards, as these will allow you to put on custom card backs. And I've also removed the transparency around them and converted them to a PNG so they are easier to use. But with all that being said, though, I hope you've enjoyed this video and are looking forward to more, as I definitely have plenty planning on coming out real soon.